This lecture is all about water, something that we all need to know about. For example, let me tell you about the time I was hiking in a hot summer when I was feeling thirsty, but a friend of mine who was hiking with me warned me against drinking the carbonated and caffeinated beverage that I had. They told me that the caffeinated beverage would not rehydrate me, and in fact, it would make me more dehydrated. Another time, I was visiting the Mount Wilson Observatory. It's a beautiful telescope, 10,000 feet on the top of Mount Wilson. And despite the fact that I was drinking on a regular basis and thought I was doing well to keep hydrated, I became fairly dehydrated fairly quickly. Also, I have many patients that have to be concerned with their hydration. For example, migraine patients may get a migraine if they become dehydrated, and many have noted to me that they get dehydrated if they take a jet ride. Now, they're curious as to why that might happen. About 65% of the adult body is comprised of water by weight. That's a lot. I mean, water is the elixir of life. We all need it to survive. And it's not surprising, therefore, that psychologically it represents to us the very notion of purity and health, right? We all need to protect our precious bodily fluids. Even in cool temperatures, a person can only survive for about 10 days without fresh water. And yet there are many misconceptions and much false information out there about this most basic element of all life. How much water should we drink every day? If you're dehydrated, should you drink drinks with caffeine in them? Are expensive water purifiers really worth it? So where do we get our water from? Well, of course, we get water from drinking fresh water, and pretty much any fluid that we drink will be mostly water and will rehydrate us or keep us hydrated. But interestingly, about 20% of the water that we get comes from food that we eat. That's an average number, 20%. There's actually a lot of variability in how much water there is in food. So-called juicy foods like fruit contain a great deal of water. They may be 60 to 90% water. And there are some surprising foods, like even a cooked hamburger will have 40 to 50% water in it. Of course, very dried foods will have less water. So depending on the kind of foods that you eat, you'll get different amounts of water from your food. But again, about 20% of your water intake comes from the food you eat rather than fluids that you're drinking. Now, in other animals, interestingly, they may get more water from their food. Koala bears, in fact, rarely drink water at all. They don't have to drink water. They can get 100% of their fluid from the eucalyptus leaves that they eat. And of course, sea creatures get all of their water from what they eat because they live in salt water. They have no access to fresh water. The primary mechanism, biologically, by which we maintain our hydration is thirst. Now, thirst is a powerful emotion that motivates us to drink, to eat and to drink. When we feel as if we are thirsty, our body is telling us that we need fluid, and that motivates us to engage in the proper behavior. This actually is, in fact, a very fine-tuned system of self-regulation. Generally speaking, you don't have to think too much about how much water is in your body. You just follow your thirst and let your body do the rest. Thirst actually serves two functions. First, it regulates the concentration of salt and other electrolytes in our blood. That is a property of the blood and tissues called osmolality. It's basically a technical term for concentration in the blood. And also, it regulates the overall volume of water in our bodies. Now, since thirst and other mechanisms that I'll mention are regulating both osmolality and fluid volume, it's interesting to understand how the two things interact. By and large, they go hand in hand. When you're on the dry side, when you're dehydrated, your fluid volume will be lower and your osmolality will be increased at the same time. And therefore, drinking fresh water or most of the sources of fluid that we would drink will correct both a high osmolality and dehydration, so there's no problem. But generally speaking, most of the time, the osmolality gets the priority. Actually, our bodies are have evolved to very carefully and closely regulate osmolality within a fairly narrow range, because it does have the priority in terms of the mechanisms of regulating these two things. However, the more dehydrated we get, the lower our fluid volume becomes, the more that fluid volume takes priority. If you're severely dehydrated, overall fluid volume takes absolute priority, and all of your body mechanisms will shift into a mode where they are conserving water at all costs. The other mechanism, other than thirst, the other primary mechanism by which our bodies regulate our own fluid is micturition, which is just a fancy word for urination. Our kidneys, our genitourinary system, this is the primary mechanism by which our bodies will regulate water volume and concentration. Simply put, our kidneys will flush our blood. Basically, the blood filters through the kidneys. The kidneys, moment to moment, are sensing the amount of overall concentration in the blood. They're also receiving hormonal signals from other parts of the body, like the heart and the brain, which are telling the kidneys what the overall fluid volume in the body is. And then the kidneys will concentrate the urine based upon all these signals, and will also adjust the concentration of many specific components. So not just the overall concentration, but the individual concentrations of sodium, potassium, calcium, and chloride, for example. So one question that comes up is, how useful is urine color in determining our overall state of hydration? Is that a myth that you can rely upon your urine? Well, it turns out it's actually a pretty good rough marker, although there are a few caveats. When your urine becomes more and more concentrated, it will go from a pale, pale yellow at the dilute end to a darker yellow, then amber, and then even a brownish color at the maximally concentrated end. So if you, for example, you may notice with your first urination in the morning, you haven't eaten or had anything to drink for 8+ hours, your urine is usually pretty dark. But then if you drink a lot of fluid during the day, it may become very, very pale yellow. That's your kidney doing its job, varying the concentration of urine depending on how much fluid there is in your body. So if you want to get an idea about your overall state of hydration, you can simply look at your urine, although you probably should use the average color over several urinations. But here come the caveats now. For example, there are certain things that you can eat which can also change the color of your urine. There are certain vitamins, there are certain food coloring dyes that may alter the specific color of your urine, so that may throw you off a little bit. But generally speaking, it's a good, reliable indicator. Now, we do more in terms of our fluid status than just drink and urinate, although those are the two primary mechanisms by which we regulate our osmolality and our overall fluid volume. There are other ways in which our body loses water. For example, sweating. Now, sweating primarily is a mechanism to regulate body temperature, not body fluid. However, it does involve excreting saline, salty water from our sweat glands, and that water then evaporates, and that evaporation takes heat away from our skin, and that cools off our bodies. In hot and in dry environments or with physical activity, sweating, however, can be a significant source of water loss, and therefore it may dramatically increase the amount of fluid we need to drink in order to replace what we lose through sweat. When we're dehydrated, again, as I said, the more dehydrated we become, the more all of our bodily fluid mechanisms shift into conserving fluid. So the amount that you sweat will progressively decrease the more dehydrated you become. If you stop sweating, not because you're cool, but because you're dehydrated, then you lose a very important mechanism of regulating your temperature, and this can lead to heat stroke. In fact, that's the most common cause of heat stroke, dehydration combined with the hot temperature. Now, as I said, sweat is not just water, it's salty water, and you've probably tasted sweat. It tastes salty. We're losing salt, sodium chloride, and other electrolytes in the sweat as well, and those too need to be replaced. So drinking just water is not going to be sufficient. Another thing that we do every day that causes us to lose water is breathe. With every breath you take, as the police song goes, right, we lose water. Water is lost through evaporation. And in fact, when we have patients in the hospital and we are carefully regulating their fluid input and output in order to monitor the function of their organs, like their kidney, their heart, and their lungs, we can calculate everything we put into the body and everything that comes out of the body, but there's what we call insensible water loss. Insensible water loss is what we can't measure, but it's happening nonetheless. And we just estimate that. So in a hospital environment, an average person will lose a couple of hundred cc's of water just from evaporation through breathing. However, the drier the environment, the more water you will lose through breathing. And this can become very significant. Here, dryness is probably more of a factor than the heat itself. In fact, mountain climbers learn that when they are at a high altitude, the air becomes not only thinner, but typically much drier. And even though there may be snow on the ground and it can be very cold, the dryness can cause a tremendous increase in the insensible water loss through breathing. In fact, that's what happened to me when I was on the top of Mount Wilson. It was cool. I wasn't really engaged in any strenuous activity. But at 10,000 feet, it was very dry, and I lost a lot of fluid much more quickly than I usually do. So, one of the big myths of water is how much water should we drink every day? Typically, what you will hear is that you need to drink 8 8-ounce glasses of water per day. But is that really what you need to drink? Do you have to go out of your way and count up how many glasses of water you drink? This myth probably originates from the Food and Nutrition Board, who calculated the average water needs of an average adult, again, with average activity and environment, and they came up with the figure of 64 to 80 ounces per day. 8 times 8 ounces is 64. That's probably where the 8 by 8 myth came from. However, in that same report, they also noted that on average, most people are also going to be getting 20% of their fluid intake, of their water intake, from the food that they eat, and then the rest from fluid. So even if you need 64 or even up to 80 ounces, 20% of that is coming from your food, so you don't have to drink it all as water. Also, it's interesting to note that most people just going about their day without paying any attention to how much they're drinking are going to be getting more than the 64 to 80 ounces of fluid. So again, you don't have to go out of your way to count up how many glasses of water that you're drinking. Now, what about thirst? You know, I've often heard that by the time you're thirsty, it's already too late. You are already dehydrated, and therefore you have to consciously hydrate yourself and not just rely upon thirst. Well, when you think about it, that doesn't really make that much sense overall, because thirst has evolved over millions of years to be a mechanism to tightly regulate, how much fluid we need in our body. It really wouldn't work very well if you didn't become thirsty until after it was too late. That would kind of be like the gas gauge on your car only telling you when you've already run out of gas. In general, you can rely upon your thirst. You will become thirsty long before you're actually dehydrated. Again, the systems have evolved to be very tightly regulate our fluid intake. So the bottom line is trust your thirst. The thirst works, and you don't have to force fluid even when you don't feel like drinking. Now, I mentioned before that a friend of mine had heard that caffeinated drinks do not hydrate and, in fact, will make your hydration worse. They'll dehydrate you. This is based on a kernel of truth, like many myths are. Many myths are often based upon that little kernel of truth, in that caffeine is a weak diuretic. A diuretic is something that stimulates your kidneys to excrete more fluid, to dilute the urine and to waste water. So, yeah, caffeine is a slight diuretic. Therefore, if you drink a lot of caffeine, it could plausibly make you lose fluid. However, when you dig down a little bit deeper, it turns out that the diuretic effect of caffeine is actually very mild. Also, frequent caffeine drinkers will become tolerant to that effect, meaning that they don't get the diuretic effect from caffeine after a while. After even just a few weeks of regular caffeine use, it no longer has that effect on your body. And also the fluid that is contained in most caffeinated beverages will more than compensate for this mild diuretic effect. So if you're out on a hot summer day and all you have is a caffeinated cola or other beverage to drink, go ahead and drink it. It will still hydrate you. What I've been talking about up to this point mostly is the usual environmental conditions, as most people go about their day-to-day life under most circumstances. However, there are special situations in which we do need to pay a little bit more attention to our hydration, and where dehydration can occur so quickly that if you don't have ready access to fluid, you may in fact become dehydrated. The first to talk about is hot weather. And this one I think is the one that would make most sense and that most people would think about. Now, as I said, the hotter it is, the more we sweat in order to cool ourselves off, and the more fluid we will therefore lose. We also will lose more fluid through the insensible loss, the evaporation from breathing. Therefore, whenever you're going to be in a warm or hot environment, you need to make sure that you have access to fluid so that you can continuously hydrate yourself. Really, dehydration results from just not having access to the fluid for a period of time. Fortunately, our bodies also do what's called acclimate. They acclimate to a hot situation by adjusting. Our bodies will naturally hold on to more fluid. We will lose less water and less salt through our sweat as we spend more and more time in a hot climate. But what this also means is that when you are traveling from a cool environment to a hot environment, you're taking a vacation in the tropics, you're not acclimated to the heat, you can become dehydrated even quicker. And also that first really hot day in the spring when the thermometer climbs above 90 and people are outside, they don't realize that after a long winter and a cool spring, they're not acclimated to the heat, and therefore you have to be especially cautious at those times. Now, athletes often push human endurance to its limits, and water is no exception. Athletes can lose as much as 2 liters of sweat per hour. 2 liters. That means they may need to drink 12 liters of fluid in a day in order to just maintain their hydration. Now, that's a situation where if you're not going out of your way to steadily drink, you can easily become dehydrated. However, there's a cautionary downside to this as well. Aggressively hydrating, even sports drinks that contain electrolytes, can actually worsen the dilution of electrolytes or the loss of electrolytes from the blood. Remember how I spoke about osmolality and fluid concentration and fluid volume? Well, if you're struggling to maintain your fluid volume, then you can actually dilute out and reduce the osmolality in your blood, and that could actually even get to dangerous levels. Now, most people think that if you drink a sports drink that has electrolytes in it, this won't happen, right? It puts back what your body's missing, as the advertisements say. However, while they are much better than straight water, they're still what we call hypotonic, meaning they have less salt and electrolytes in them, much less than what's in your blood, and therefore it will still tend to dilute out the electrolytes in your blood when you have to drink gallons and gallons or liters of this fluid. The only way to really maintain your osmolality when you're drinking that much fluid is to eat, especially salty snacks. So it's basically when you push the body to its limits with extremes of athletic endurance, if you overwhelm the regulatory systems, and you do have to be careful about how much you drink, what kind of fluid you're drinking, and also you do need to eat. I had spoken about high altitudes and my trip to Mount Wilson. So there are other situations other than being at a world-famous telescope where you might be at a high altitude. Probably the most common situation in which the average person finds themselves at a high altitude is when they are flying in a jet to go somewhere. At 6,000 feet, just from the thinning of the atmosphere, water loss through breathing is double normal. You will lose water at twice the rate. And this becomes progressively more of a factor as you get higher and higher in altitude. At 10,000 feet, where I was at Mount Wilson, it's triple. You lose it at 3 times the rate. Now, jet cabins are partially pressurized. If you're flying at 39,000 feet, you're not feeling the pressures that are outside the airplane at 39,000 feet. You would pass out. That's why they instruct you about how to breathe through those breathing masks, right? But if you're in a Boeing 747 at 39,000 feet, the cabin is pressurized to about 6,900 feet of pressure. Again, you're at a little bit more than double the rate of insensible loss through breathing in the cabin. And also, jets like to keep their cabins dry. It's better for the equipment and everything inside the airplane. So now you're in a dry and a low-pressure environment where water loss can be much more rapid than you think, than you're used to. And also, you're kind of confined to your seat, so access to water may be limited. The stewardesses or stewards may be slow in bringing you water. So it's actually recommended that you have some kind of fluid with you when you're going to be taking especially a long flight in order to make sure that you don't become dehydrated. Now, there are many medical conditions in which fluid management becomes more complicated. And again, what I've been discussing up to now is your average healthy adult or healthy person. But there are many medical conditions in where we have to pay particular attention to fluid status. I already mentioned that in the hospital, when patients are sick, we may count up every cc, every milliliter of fluid, and very, very carefully manage it. So let me give you some examples of some medical conditions where fluid management is more important and where the regular mechanisms of thirst and micturition may not be adequate. For example, if the kidneys themselves are not working with kidney insufficiency or kidney failure, the kidneys may not be able to keep up with their demands and put out enough fluid. You might need to restrict your fluid intake in order not to overwhelm the kidney's ability to deal with the fluid. Or with heart failure. In heart failure, the heart can't pump enough blood to the kidneys, and the fluid starts to get backed up in the heart and backed up in the lungs. And again, the only real treatment for that is fluid restriction, or doctors may prescribe artificial diuretics, diuretics that will sort of coax the kidney into getting rid of more fluid. There's also kidney stones. Now, kidney stones, if you've ever had them, you'll know it's one of the most painful medical conditions that there are. These are usually formed from calcium oxalate or calcium phosphate, and they are sharp little crystals that get stuck in either the ureter, the tube that connects the kidney to the bladder, or the urethra, the tube that drains the urine from the bladder. That could be extremely painful. You have this small, little, delicate tube with this sharp, knife-like crystal inside that has to work its way all the way down this long tube. Very, very painful. If you are at risk for developing kidney stones, either because you have a family history or because you have some particular metabolic situation that can lead to increased risk of kidney stones, or maybe you're on certain medications that increase the risk of kidney stones, you may have to pay particular attention to your hydration. It may not be enough to just listen to your thirst. You may actually need to keep an eye on your urine. We tell patients, look at your urine. It should always be pale yellow, and force a little bit more fluid than you would naturally drink just from thirst in order to keep your urine very dilute, and that will minimize and reduce the risk of developing those painful kidney stones. Now, diarrhea or dysentery is actually a serious medical condition. Throughout most of human history, this has been a very significant cause of death. In fact, before the modern age, most soldiers who die in an army campaign don't die of their wounds. They would die of things like dysentery. What happens here is that an infection in the intestines will cause the bowels to stop absorbing fluid, water, from the food and the fluid that we drink. But even worse than that, even worse than the fact that it's not absorbing fluid, it actually can secrete fluid into the intestines, which then, of course, come out the other end as diarrhea. In fact, a severe case of dysentery can cause somebody to secrete and lose 10 or 12 liters of fluid every day just through the intestines. So imagine losing that much fluid and not being able to replace it by drinking, by absorbing it. It's no wonder that people become rapidly dehydrated and die. from this condition. In fact, only modern medicine really can save people from death from dysentery. In essence, we have to give them intravenous fluid. We have to bypass the intestines until they have a chance to heal, and we have to replace all the lost fluid with intravenous fluid, usually saline, something that's close to what the blood is, in order to give people time and keep them alive for the infection or whatever is causing the dysentery to have a chance to work itself out. Migraines are another medical situation where hydration becomes important. I'm a neurologist. I treat migraines every day. It's one of the most common situations that I see. Now, migraines can be triggered by dehydration. So often, migraineurs have to be especially careful not to get caught behind the eight ball, as we say. Don't let yourself be stuck without access to fluid. I don't force them to again, drink a lot of fluid on an average day when they're not having a migraine, but they do need to make sure they don't get dehydrated. However, when they're having a migraine, part of that migraine can cause nausea and even vomiting. But even if they're not vomiting, which is another way, it's a pathological way in which we can lose a lot of water and electrolytes, even if they're not vomiting, the fact that they don't feel like eating or drinking, they have anorexia and nausea from the migraine, means that they can quickly become dehydrated. In essence, it's a pathological situation in which the normal feedback loops of thirst and urination are short-circuited by the nausea. And even in the course of half a day, a patient with a migraine can become severely dehydrated, enough that it actually worsens their headache and may make it last for 2 or 3 days. So one of the most effective treatments for a migraine is to force fluids, even if they don't really feel like eating or drinking, in order to stave off the dehydration that would otherwise occur. I'm going to talk about now a couple of questions that frequently come up with respect to water. One is bottled water. Should we buy bottled water? Is there an advantage to it? Is it healthier? Does it taste better? Well, interestingly, bottled water costs about 1,900 times as much as good old-fashioned tap water. It's more costly than gasoline. But bottled water, actually, if you look at it statistically, it's no better than tap water. It's no more healthy, and it often in taste tests, it doesn't taste any better. In fact, some cities have better tasting tap water than most brands of bottled water. And also, some bottled water is, in fact, literally tap water. They're bottling tap water and then selling it to you at almost 2,000 times the cost. So bottled water, overall, is basically a scam. You're better off just buying containers that you can reuse and filling them from your own tap. What about water purifiers? Things that you install in the sink or in your home in order to filter out organisms or impurities or heavy metals from your water. Well, most modern industrialized countries like the United States have agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and they monitor and regulate water very closely. Currently, there are no major safety issues with tap water in the U.S. or other industrialized countries. However, this is largely regulated at a city and regional area. So if you have any questions or concerns, you can look up at the EPA or a similar organization. You can look up what the reports about the quality of the water in your local area is to reassure yourself that your water that you're drinking is safe. Now, some people have well water. Well water is a different matter altogether because it's not on any kind of citywide system. Well water does need to be tested, first to initially certify that the well water is safe, but also if it's been many, many years and your home has well water, you may want to get it occasionally retested to make sure there's nothing leaching into the water. And if there are any problems with your well water, you may want to have it filtered, in fact. There is no evidence, however, for most people, as long as you are on a city system, that water purifiers improve the safety of water. Most publicly available water is perfectly safe. The primary use or legitimate use for water purifiers is to increase the taste of water. And there you can just follow your own taste. If your tap water tastes fine to you, then don't worry about it. If it doesn't taste right, if it tastes a little chlorinated, or there's just a taste in there that you don't like, then you may want to get a water purifier just to improve the taste of the water. even though it won't necessarily be more healthful. But even there, you can usually attach those purifiers either just to the sink that you drink out of, your kitchen sink, for example, or you can have a water purifier on the water that you get out of the refrigerator door, for example, the cooled water. So the water that you're going to drink, you're going to purify. But you don't necessarily have to put a water purifier on the entire home for all of the water that you use for doing your laundry, for example. And also, the studies show that the inexpensive or modest purifiers perform just as well as the systems that cost many thousands of dollars. So don't believe all the hype of the salesman who's telling you that you have to spend $5,000 or more on some expensive system-wide or house-wide water purifier system. And there are organizations that do review such products, so you can go to them to see if the product you're thinking of buying for not too much money, $50, $100, how well it works. What about ionized water? Some companies will try to sell you ionized water that has some either health benefits or will make your blood more acidic or more alkaline. These are pure scams. Pure water cannot be ionized. There's H plus and OH minus to a certain amount in all water, but they are constantly recombining with each other to make H2O, and it's in an equilibrium steady state. You can't ionize water and have it stay ionized for more than a very short period of time. And bottom line, there's no proven health benefits to it, or oxygenated water, or any other kind of magic or miracle water, so just don't believe it. So that was a quick trip through our precious bodily fluids, the elixir of life, water, and hopefully I've corrected some common misconceptions that are out there. The bottom line I want you to come away with is that you should trust your thirst. Your body knows that it needs water, it carefully regulates water, and in most situations, if you just listen to your thirst, you'll do fine.